so excited to host this webinar series, which is called Back to the Basics. And we also have a beautiful brochure here that can be shared in your churches, which is Safe Church Basics, 5 Steps to a Safer Church. And this webinar is part 3 of the 5 steps. In the first webinar, we covered assessing risk. And so you can check that out on our YouTube page. And the second webinar was making and revising policy, in which we shared a model policy. And in this webinar, we are focusing on training volunteers and leaders in our churches. And so I am so excited to be here with Becky and Amanda and to learn with them and from them as they lead us in this webinar. And before we begin and turn it over to them, please join me in prayer. So Triune God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the gift of learning through your Spirit and in community, how to better go forward as your church in ways that prevent abuse, that acknowledge the risks that are all around us in this world, and that we can look to you for guidance and that you are with us amidst all of the challenges we face. And so continue to help us as we find ways and strategies to further train those who are members and leaders within our congregations to prevent abuse. And so we thank you for your presence here today. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Thanks so much, Eric, and welcome everybody. We are so glad that you are here for our third webinar today. And so I'm going to be leading the webinar and inviting Amanda and Eric to join me alongside, where we're going to be talking about ideas for training. I know that for myself, I've had a lot of people reaching out to me asking for different ways that they could be training within their roles of churches. And we wanted to put together some tips and tricks today and give you some best practices for how we're going to be leading that. So I'm just going to share my screen. 1 minute. There we go. All right, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 more second. Just sorry. We're just going to do 1 more screen share to try this over again. And we're going to start out in another spot. All righty, let's start at the beginning, shall we? All right, so I just want to welcome everybody to the third of our series. And we have a question for you as we start. And what we'd like to encourage all of you to do is just put into chat, why is training important? So why is training important to you? And we'll just take a moment, and I'm going to have Amanda and Eric just look through the chats and just read some of the responses that we're coming up with. And as you're thinking about that question of why is it important, just what we're going to be really looking at today is, I know that many of you have been working really hard on putting your policies together, and you've put all this effort into it. And now how are we going to move forward and actually share all the pieces of that with everybody? And that's the part that we're going to be looking at with training. So why is training so important for you within your own church? I'm going to stop share for a minute.
And while you're thinking of answers, I know that come August in our church, there's always this announcement: if you're volunteering in a ministry, come to Safe Church training to be prepared for the work that you're going to do as a volunteer. And there's kind of a subtle groan about the fact that, here we want to volunteer, here we want to give of ourselves to a ministry, and now we have to go through a training that doesn't always feel super exciting, or it's not, especially if it's held after the church service and you're thinking, I really don't want to spend another 2 hours at church on that Sunday. So the question is, why do we do this? It's not like volunteers are lining up at the door saying, can you train us in Safe Church? So why do we do this? And maybe if we can sort of consolidate our ideas about why we do training, we can help cast a vision for our volunteers volunteers that will get them a little bit excited about why we do training and why it's so important.
We realize that chat is disabled, and so if you want to put in your question or the answer into the Q&A, that will work as well.
Yeah, and chat's just been updated, so we should all be able to chat. All righty. While you're sorry.
Oh, yeah, I was just, as chats were going to come in, I was thinking about how this is such a big question, and it can matter so differently to so many different people. And I know in some people, for some people that I know, it's not just something that needs to be covered, but it's a very personal journey for them because they have experienced different levels of abuse. And I know when I preached on this topic, it's become very apparent to me after I've preached when different people come up and mention that they had to actually walk out because of the trauma they have been experiencing. And that to me, some of those comments to me were so important as to why we need to focus on abuse. And so I'm noticing some other chats that are coming in here as well. You know, Amanda, if you want to read some of those.
Yeah, and yay for technology working. It's been a morning of technological difficulty. So thank you to all of you who have joined us and are bearing with us. Great comments from all of you who are putting things in the chat. So to be protected and to protect others. I think that's an interesting comment, that learning about abuse prevention and response both teaches volunteers how to protect themselves from potential accusations or allegations of abuse, but also how to protect others, like those under their care, right? Who may be at risk for abuse. Someone said, so what happened to me doesn't happen to others. And I think, Eric, that's what you were certainly referencing, this idea that, yeah, we need to do better in the church. And especially in this day and age with the Church Too movement, it's very clear that the church has an issue with abuse, that people are not immune to abuse when they come to the church. And that's the very opposite of what they should experience. And so we need to do better. We need to be diligent about creating a culture that of care for others. And ensuring that our programs, our ministries are safe and people can come to them and feel like they can trust those who are leading in those ministries. I'll just do one more, and then Eric, maybe you want to take a few. It helps guide you and give you confidence in the topic. One of the things we're going to talk about is, you know, all these people who want to volunteer in ministry, but perhaps they don't actually know what's in your policy. And so they run into a situation and they either inadvertently violate your abuse protection policy because they don't know what's in it, or they're in a situation where they know they need to do something and they're not sure what to do. So giving your volunteers that confidence to know how to enact a duty of care, how to care for those in their under their supervision. So
Yeah, I'm noting also both the due diligence and maybe insurance requirements. I know sometimes some need the extra motivation to realize, oh, this is a legal issue. We need to be held to account, and insurance requires us to do this. For other people, they realize they don't need any more of the external pressure to do this. And I think Judy mentioned this a little bit, just not to be insurance driven, but that this is the right thing to do, and that we need to be on this because this is what the Bible calls us to. This is what Christ calls us to. Also see Bob Brookema hear that there is so much at stake. When we hear the horrible stories that this has happened in our community, in our schools, we want to ensure that we're doing this so that each person is protected and further dignified and respected. And I see a lot of other comments in that similar vein. And so thank you all for commenting and joining us in this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Just for myself, I wanted to tell you two very short stories, but an inside and out about training. So the first one is very much like an inside story of why doing training. For myself, I started a new church, a CRC church, and I had a little child. And I just thought, you know what, now's the time to start volunteering, right? She was in the nursery. I thought I would join, and automatically, like, I was connected with the Safe Church team and went through the whole process. And soon after, we had a large training. And for myself, not only was it really good to have the training, but it also allowed me to connect to the rest of the community within my church, right? And see from a parent's perspective, just how safe my child was going to be growing up in that community, knowing that all these people were volunteering. And so when I passed over to Vacation Bible School and it was time to go into GEMS and youth group, I knew that the training had been existing, and what the level was for our church. So that just made me feel very confident putting my child into the different parts of the church body. From the outside, one of the trainings that I was in, we heard a story about someone who had been abused as a child and now had her own children and wanted to find a church that was safe, right? And she went to numerous churches, basically walking in on a Tuesday and saying, what's your policy like? What do you have? Like, how can you protect my family? And, you know, it was very disheartened for 3 or 4 churches initially that she went to, where they were just sort of scrambling and trying to find a policy. And she thought, you are not prepared, right? And the last church that she visited, they were like, yeah, immediately, like, knew where to find their policy. We're able to walk through it with her because they'd had the training to understand what was actually in their policy and encourage her, like, if you were volunteering, these are the standards that we had. So she was welcomed into that community knowing that she would be safe. So it's, for me, it's always that balance of being inside the church and being, what can we do to bring people in to know that they feel safe. So then I just want to share one quote that really resonated with me as I was looking through. Fred Rogers. It's just such a wonderful person that has really guided us, I think, in our world. We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, it's not my community, not my world, not my problem. And then there are those who see the need and respond. And I consider those people my heroes. And I just would like to invite you all to just consider yourself the hero within your church. This is very important work that we're doing. And I think that we need to recognize that this is important work that we are called to do together. When we're looking at our Safe Church, we have a couple guiding verses that I just wanted to look at just quickly with you, because I think that's very important to look at our biblical calling for being in this ministry. And the first one is Ezekiel 34:28. They live in safety and no one will make them afraid. And I think that is such an important piece that we need to stand by and align with and understand that is the calling that God has put forward for us, that we are living into within our role within this ministry. And then the second one, it always makes me smile. I don't know, for myself, this is my kids could ramble off this verse because they were in GEMS within their church, and this was the Bible verse that they memorized year after year. So he showed you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. And when we're thinking about that, what does that actually mean? So we want to break down act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. So we are called within a space towards justice. We are wanting to speak up for the vulnerable, and that is what our calling is. And with mercy, how do we do that? We are here with compassion. And compassion is that feeling that arises when you're confronted with another's suffering. And feel motivated to help with that suffering. And so I think that that's a space that we can all recognize is what for you brings you to this space? What is your story? What is that piece of empathy that really brings you into this space to work within Safe Church? And to finally walk humbly. we realize that we are human. We have our failings, we have our limitations and our mistakes and our humanity, right? And that God is calling us and guiding us to continue to walk humbly, and that this work is very important that we're doing. So we want to really encourage you to look at our training now in terms of how are you going to provide training, right? And what we want to do is look at, and we want to just have you repeat all the time, is this, the 3 pillars for training for us consist of awareness, prevention, and protection. And so we're going to continue to look back at that. And that's really how we've structured this training, is looking at first, you want to build an awareness within your community. You want to work towards your prevention, and then your protection follow through. So what does that actually mean? And we're going to break that down and look at that. What I also want to just recognize is that this is also just something that we have really learned from Plan to Protect. They will be a resource that we mentioned a few times. We have affiliations that we work with as we're building our Safe Church ministry. And for myself, I recently went through their training. And so there'll be some resources later at the end, but this is one of the pieces that they really speak to, is these 3 pillars of doing your training. So when we're thinking about awareness, we're thinking about, like, you want to question yourself like, who needs the protection, right? What constitutes abuse? How prevalent is the abuse? What is the impact of abuse? Does your church have a safe church policy? And does your church have a safe church team? So these are sort of the questions that you're wanting to be asking, and not just yourself, but you're wanting the whole church as a community to be asking these questions and finding that they are very important things to consider within your safe church. And then prevention. So what policies and procedures does your church have in place to prevent abuse from happening within your church community? And finally, in terms of protection, we're going to look at what protocols and procedures we have in place when abuse does happen. So the first part that we're going to look at is the awareness piece. So what constitutes the abuse and what is the impact of the abuse? And we really just want to build a whole awareness around this piece. So the first thing we're going to do is look at a quote. And again, Faith Trust Institute is another organization that we link to that has some fabulous resources that we've been able to receive. So that too will be a resource that we'll link at the end so that you can do a deep dive into their information as well. So abuse refers to an act committed by a parent, caregiver, or person in a position of trust, which is non-accidental and which harms or threatens to harm someone's physical or mental health or someone's welfare. I'm just going to stop sharing at this point. All right. So that was a lot of pieces of information that we just brought to you in terms of the awareness piece. But then we also just want to look at how we break down various forms of abuse. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda to look at.
Yeah, so thank you, Becky. So yeah, when you're doing your training, it's really helpful to lay out what do we mean when we say abuse? What does that look like, so that people have a good understanding even of what constitutes abuse and what they're preventing, and then what they're responding to in cases where they suspect abuse. I think in the past, we have really thought of abuse primarily and almost exclusively in terms of children and vulnerable adults. And one of the things we're growing in our awareness of is that abuse can happen at any age. And abuse really is about someone who's in a position of power or influence misusing that power or influence to control someone else and bring them harm, right? So it's really helpful when you're training your volunteers to kind of talk a little bit about what is it that we mean by abuse. And so in our model Safe Church policy, in fact, we have definitions of what we mean by abuse, and that they include definitions around physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and then in your own Safe Church policy, you might want to include something like spiritual abuse. We have assumed at this point that that is a subcategory of emotional abuse. And all of these forms of abuse, and I'm going to go through them in a minute, but all of these forms of abuse are abuses of power. They're about someone who is in a position of power and influence over a child, a vulnerable adult, or even a member of the congregation, using their power in ways that bring harm. And when that happens, what they're doing is they're breaking sacred trust. So Becky, I'm actually going to have you scroll back. Let's just look at the definition of physical abuse for a minute, because in your training, you want to lay these things out. You want to go through this so that your volunteers know exactly what we're talking about when we mean abuse. So physical abuse or physical misconduct is threatened harm or non-accidental injury inflicted on a minor or vulnerable adult, or offensive or harmful contact with an adult. Notice that it spans the whole spectrum of age groups there, right? Physical misconduct can happen whether between an adult and a child or between two adults. A physical misconduct is sometimes a single event, but more often a chronic pattern of interacting with a minor or an adult. And one of the things to be aware of is that while you can abuse someone in a single event, and that's a serious offense, what we tend to look for is patterns of behavior, right? When we're talking about abuse. And we're going to see that especially when we're talking about emotional abuse. And I think that's another thing that's helpful to train your volunteers in, to look for patterns of behavior. All right, let's go to sexual abuse. Sexual misconduct or abuse is exploiting or grooming. So someone who is engaged in the act of establishing an emotional relationship for the purpose of establishing a physical sexual relationship, that also is sexual misconduct, right? So exploiting or grooming a minor or an adult, regardless of consent or circumstances, for the purposes of sexual touch, sexual activity, or emotional intimacy, with the result of either sexual gratification or power and control over the minor and or adult. Sexual misconduct is also unwelcome touch, sexual activity, or emotional intimacy between coworkers, co-volunteers, or sexual touch, sexual activity, or emotional intimacy between a supervisor and a subordinate who serve together in a church program or church ministry. I think this one is really important because sometimes we think when there are two adults in serving in ministry or who are involved in the church, that it's consensual and that it's not really our business, except unless it's outside of the bounds of marriage or there's an affair or some kind of thing like that. And we usually label it in that way. But when one person holds a position of power in the church and it's an adult, they're having a relationship with an adult who's a member of the congregation, that is considered sexual abuse, because they're using their power and their influence in a way that controls or grooms another adult for their own sexual gratification. All right, let's keep going. Emotional misconduct. This is new. We had this approved by the COD and then Synod in terms of a definition of emotional abuse or emotional misconduct. A pattern of behavior in which a person insults, humiliates, and manipulates an individual or group in order to establish or maintain control over them. So it could include threatening a person's safety, property, or loved ones, isolating a person from family, friends, or acquaintances. We often see this when there's secrecy around a relationship. Shh, don't tell anyone about this. That's a way of isolating someone. Demeaning, bullying, belittling, shaming, or humiliating a person, delivering constant criticism, or emotionally blackmailing or harassing a person. So what I would encourage you to do in your training is kind of expand people's understanding of what we're talking about when we mean abuse. I think that will actually help volunteers get their heads around this whole idea of what is abuse and what do we need to be looking out for, and when do we need to consider that we might need to do something to respond to abuse. Oh, you put spiritual abuse in here. I'm gonna skip that one.
Yeah. And then I think you
I referenced
went
this
through abuse of
earlier,
power.
right?
Yeah.
So all of these things are considered abuse of power and a breaking of the sacred trust that the church has placed on you, the congregation has placed on you. So just to even emphasize that volunteers are given a position of privilege and power and influence, and that is a sacred trust that is allotted to them. And so to be mindful of how they are using their power and their influence. All right, Becky, go for it.
Thanks so much, Annette. Yeah, the other part of awareness is thinking about how can you expand the awareness throughout your church, right? So for us, it's not just that one training that you'll have once a year, hopefully, but it's the awareness that throughout your whole church, that people are aware that Safe Church is a very vibrant part of your community. So one of the ways that we really encourage you to do that is by really looking at Safe Church, the Abuse Awareness Sunday, as a very important piece of your church life. So for us, it always happens the fourth Sunday of the year. So for this year, it's falling on September 25th. Now, we always put together a lot of resources. So we're going to be sharing this slideshow afterwards with our network posts. So these links are all active. So you can click on the link for worship resources and just find, we're going to be populating it over the next month. You'll see a lot of like a direction for the sermon that the pastor could be encouraged to look at, songs, worships, litanies, laments. We're just going to have a very full piece that you can really turn to. And then it really helps. The other thing is, like, so many times we've heard, it is so helpful for someone who has gone through abuse to be sitting in a service where the pastor is speaking with the conversation about abuse. It just really brings it to be recognized as a very important piece that the church understands is important for the safety of their community. Now, last year, we put together a video for Safe Church, and we wanted to just play a short little bit of it so that you can see it. We would encourage you, this is a great way. It's a short video, but I think it's 2.5 minutes long, maybe 3. And it would be great at the beginning of your Abuse Awareness Sunday. So let me just start it for us, and we'll watch a short bit of it together.
Safe Church Ministry, not just a policy, but a way of being the church. For Evelyn, who wants to feel safe in her church community. For Jada, who wants help leaving a home with violence. For Michael, who is healing from childhood abuse. For Susie, who wants to be in a relationship built on respect. For the 1 in 4 women and the 1 in 6 men who experience sexual abuse in their lifetime. What would it take for them to feel safe and valued in your church community? What would it take to support them in their journey towards healing?
All right. So this basically, and then it continues on to show a lot of resources that we have as Safe Church, and we continue to build on those resources every year.
Safe Church.
Alrighty. So then, so as we were saying, we're looking at the 3 pillars. So the second pillar is prevention. So we want to just spend some time looking at that now and what that means. So prevention for us, we want to create a community that is built on love and respect, as we said as well in the video. And we want to have a safe environment where people can worship free from fear of abuse. So what does that actually look like? So from the first thing we want to do is I'm going to turn it to Amanda to look at, I'm going to read the bullets, but what we're going to do is actually encourage everybody to put into chat some thoughts around reducing risk. So I'm going to go through the basic 4 main principles of reducing risk in terms of preventing abuse. And then as we look at each one, I'll give a quick example, but we'd love to hear from you just in terms of what comes to mind for you, examples of how you could reduce risk. So the first one that we're going to look at is risk increases when there is an imbalance of power, authority, influence, and control between a potential abuser and a potential victim. I'm going to let you think about that and then just drop to chat, and then Amanda and Eric can be reading that and jump in. So I'll just start by giving an example. I think the first thing for reducing risk around imbalance of power is just educating people on that, right? And so for us, what we've started to do is we have a learning module on abuse of power. The Power to Do Good is a learning program that we've started to integrate. And I know that we've had new pastors that have been starting to take that program. We've shared it on with a lot of our coordinators, and just encourage that pastors and lay leaders. It's not a long course to take, but it really gives a high level understanding of what abuse of power is, what it looks like within your church, and what you can do to mitigate the risk around abuse of power. So that would be one way of reducing the risk in regards to abuse of power. Was there anything else that came up in chat?
Yeah, again, I think I just want to frame this as it's really helpful for volunteers to understand this, that there are greater amounts of risk in certain situations, and just to be conscious and aware of that, so that they take the appropriate and proper precautions. So, as Becky noted, when there's an imbalance of power, which is any time a person is holding a ministry position, there's an imbalance of power between them and the person who they're ministering to. So just to recognize, okay, that imbalance of power creates a risk. It also creates an opportunity. And how do we use the opportunity for good and protect ourselves against the risk of doing harm?
I think one example of this might be, and one that I hear more often than not, is not necessarily an adult who has the imbalance of power, but an older peer. So maybe a 16, 17-year-old who actually has a level of authority over some 7th graders or 6th graders, 11 to 13-year-olds. And so that's a pretty big imbalance of power when you have and oftentimes I don't have the percentages or the statistics on it, but there are many who are in that position of power who are not an adult yet, but they're given this trust without the supervision and accountability. And so that's, I think, one example of an increased risk as well.
I'm going to look at the next one. So risk increases as isolation increases. So just from my own experience, I do a lot of meetings. I've had a lot of meetings with volunteers. In a previous job, I had a small office, and I would have volunteer interviews in that office. And I was very conscious of the fact that it felt isolated in that space. So what do I do to mitigate that risk? And for me, it meant there was a window that had been previously sort of closed off that they opened up for me so that people could easily see within that office. And also the door was never closed, right? When I had meetings within that office, it was a very busy corner of the space of the building, and the door was always open and the window was very easily to see. And so that was just a way to just mitigate that risk when I was realizing that the volunteer could feel in a position of isolation in a space. Is there any other suggestions that people have, or any thoughts around that within your own church community or building?
Yeah, I see this one. Have elder visits with church members in restaurants if possible.
Yeah.
That's such a good comment. Yeah, that elders, I think we've grown used to this idea that it's okay for elders to visit, alone in the home of someone, an older adult, a widow, perhaps. But those create difficult situations and high risk because of the one-on-one and the isolation. So.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to move to the next one. So risk increases as accountability decreases. So an example I can give of this one is that I think what we've seen over the past couple of years as we're living through a pandemic and we've had to shift platforms of how we connect is there was technology was used a lot for youth, and there was not, we had to really jump in and make sure that there was policies around that. There wasn't as much accountability prior. And suddenly, as people needed to start using Instagram and Facebook for connecting, we needed to put in different protocols in place so that the risk was decreased. So that accountability piece needed to be raised very quickly so that we could make sure that everybody was accountable to how to be respectful within that space, and the abuse could not happen within that space. Any other thoughts that people have about accountability around this piece of accountability? Okay, I'm just going to move on to the final one so that we can make sure that works for everybody. Just because we have a lot we want to give you is, as risk increases, supervision should also increase, right? So if you're looking at the idea of, for instance, a baby being in the space, they are small, they're young, and they will need to have more supervision. Whereas if you're looking at another Sunday school age, then your risk isn't as high with the younger kids. So you're having to look at what is that risk around supervision, and how do we make sure that we're mitigating that risk. So those are the 4 principles. And then we're going to move on to different steps of screening. So what to expect of ministry leaders to prevent and respond to abuse. So what we want to do is look at the training, and there's a lot of steps to it. And I realize this is always a part where people sort of reach out to me and say that this piece, the 7 steps of screening, is a fair bit of steps to go through, but it is such a vital piece. And we want to make sure that your role is really appreciated within the church, that these are just vital pieces to make sure that your volunteers have gone through the appropriate spaces so that you know that your church is well cared for. So the 7 steps we have, the first one is the 6-month waiting period. You'll want an application, the interview, references, police record check, training, and approval. And so there's a lot of pieces where you have to go over this. I know that for myself, when I was in a position of looking at for volunteer management, a lot of times the police records was something that it was sort of one and done. And, I had people that had been doing volunteering within the space for 20 years that had not gone back to get a new police record check. So what we want to make sure is that when you're looking at your Safe Church policy, what is written in your policy for the steps that you're taking for your volunteers, that should be a part of it, and that you're working through and people are understanding from your Safe Church policy in your training that these are very important steps and why are they important steps, how that makes your whole church community safer, so that people can come in feeling like they are well protected within your church. So now I'm going to turn it over to Amanda.
Perfect. So you have, in your training, you have introduced some facts and figures around abuse. Perhaps you showed the first part of our Safe Church video to get people engaged in this whole idea of what will it take to make a community safe. You've created some awareness around abuse by sharing definitions, and you've now moved on to prevention, and you've talked a little bit about risk and how the more isolated someone is, the more at risk they are, and talked a little bit about, well, how we need to be thinking about how to increase accountability and supervision. And now you want to move into your Safe Church policy to help your volunteers understand what is their responsibility in terms of prevention, right? Like, how do they need to act? What do they need to know so that they can actually participate in this good work of preventing abuse in the church? And one way to do that actually is to throw out a couple of scenarios and invite people to mull them over and consider, well, what would you do if? What would you do if this happened? So Becky, if you could move the slide. Okay, so what would you do, for instance, if you are the nursery attendant on duty and there's a 13-year-old boy who is your youth helper in the nursery, but one of the young children, recently potty trained, needs to go to the bathroom? What do you do, right? Do you know what your policy says? And we're not going to try and parse this out or answer the question. It's just a scenario that helps everybody realize, I'm not sure I know what I'm supposed to do in that kind of a situation, right? That's why we need this training. All right, let's go to the next one. So at the end of the children's ministry program, someone you don't know claims to be the father of one of the kids and is there to pick their daughter up. You've never met the father, so you don't know if this man is telling the truth or not. What do you do, right? That's another scenario that might get people thinking, I thought I was just going to volunteer for a children's ministry program. I know some things about children, and I know some things about ministry. Surely this is no big deal. For them to sort of realize, oh, I have responsibilities toward the care and protection of the children in the program that I am volunteering in. Let's keep going. Another scenario, one of the youth doesn't have a ride home from youth group and asks you for a ride home. This would mean that you are alone with the youth in the car. What do you do? So another scenario probably happens quite often, actually, but it's quite likely that church policies, safe church policies, have something in them pertaining to this very issue. And it would be really helpful for volunteers to know what's in the policy so that they can actually attend to and abide by the policy. And then finally, let's go to the last one. As elders, you normally visit members of the congregation in pairs, but your partner is sick and you are scheduled to visit a single woman. Ordinarily, you would meet in the parishioner's home, but this feels really awkward. What do you do? What do you do? And again, it would be really helpful for that elder to know what is the safe church policy around this. I loved Judy's answer where she said, well, you arrange to meet in a public place, and that actually might be the response. That might be the requirement in the policy, but for elders and volunteers and deacons and et cetera to follow the policy, they need to know what's in it. So this is where you can kind of generate some interest in the policy, and then you could walk through your safe church policy. And I'm not going to do that here and now in the interest of time, but just to know that that's it's really helpful to generate some interest before you do it, because otherwise it just feels like a lot of different rules and regulations, right? So you want to create some sense of the why do we need to do this. For those who are looking for some help on bolstering their policy, we do have a new model safe church policy that has lots of good ideas in it for how you can protect your community. All right, I am going to actually turn it over, and we're going to move on from awareness and prevention, which is really all in your policy, to protection, how to spot it and how to report it.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, so we're basically looking, like we've been looking at that, but now we want to look at what are the protocols and procedures that we have in place when abuse happens. And so exactly what Amanda was saying to how to spot it, abuse and how to report it. So the one thing that I just want to just talk about is there's a couple things, 2 areas that you're wanting to be looking for. You're going to be wanting to look for physical abuse and behavioral. But the thing with physical abuse is, I think that's something that we typically can spot, like you're looking for bruises, things like that. But a lot of times you'll find that it's easier to hide the physical. So you're wanting to look a lot for the behavioral, what is changing. So when because you are able within your Safe Church to have a relationship with, like the volunteers are able to have a relationship with people within your community, you are set up to be able to spot when behavioral changes are happening with the people that you're working with. And so when you're doing your training, what you'll want to do is you'll want to go over the physical abuse, physical pieces that you might see, but also really look at the behavioral pieces of what people volunteering within your church might start to be very aware of, and just have that curiosity that is built in with when they're serving within their role, just to take a little time to think about, oh, this behavior is a little different from how Johnny normally shows up for Sunday school. I wonder, and just have that curiosity piece. So just making sure that you're teaching that within your training is so important for that. And then how to report abuse. I'm going to turn that over, to Amanda.
Yeah, perfect. So you've got your volunteers gathered for your training, and you've taught them about abuse awareness and abuse prevention and their responsibilities vis-a-vis abuse prevention. And now they want to know, well, what happens if I suspect abuse? Or what happens if someone discloses abuse to me? What do I do? Right? So that needs to be part of the training so that people feel confident after the training that they know exactly what's expected of them in both the area of prevention and response. So just a couple of tips and tricks in that regard, in terms of sharing with your volunteers about how to respond. If someone discloses abuse to one of the volunteers or to a member of the council or one of the staff, and if it's a child, there's a real easy acronym to help people understand what are they supposed to do in that very moment. How do they receive the child? And the acronym is BELT-C. I'm not sure why, but anyway, it's B is believe. You want to believe the child, right? You're not going to question the child. You're just going to receive the information and believe them. Second, you want to encourage them. You want them to feel supported. You want them to feel like you are on their side, that they have an ally in you, right? Third, you want to listen. And listening is really important. It's also really important not to ask leading questions. So don't ask, did he or she hit you on the head? But ask, well, can you tell me more about what happened, right? T is for tell the child that you need to tell others to keep them safe, and then tell your supervisor. So one of the things you want to get your volunteers in the habit of doing is when they suspect abuse or when someone discloses to them abuse, that they know who they need to bring that information to for it to be responded to and acted on well, right? So volunteers should report to their supervisor, and together, if there is reasonable suspicion that this is abuse, they should report it to Child Protection Services within 24 hours, right? So that's the BELT: believe, encourage, listen, and tell. And then the C is confidentiality. Do your best to maintain confidentiality of the victim and the accused, right? You don't want to be telling everybody. So sometimes in abuse prevention policies, there's even something included about who needs to know the information, and your volunteers need to know that too. Who should they be telling what they're seeing or what is being disclosed to them? a couple of notes about that. You should really encourage your volunteers in your training not to investigate. It's not their job to investigate when they suspect abuse or when there are when there's a disclosure of abuse. They're not to try to fix the situation or contact the alleged abuser. That's not their job. Their job is really to focus on the victim and getting the victim the help and support they need, right? And then reporting to a supervisor who can take it to another level. Another thing you want to train your volunteers to do is fill out an incident report. So if they suspect something or if something happens in their ministries, that they have an incident report that they can fill out that details who and when and what and all the details that they can gather, so that they can also then pass that information on to their supervisors, so that you have a record of what's going on. And sometimes you need those records because that begins to establish the patterns of abuse that we were talking about earlier. Of course, if a minor or a vulnerable adult is in immediate danger, you should contact 911, and your volunteers need to hear that too. They need to know when they should reach out and contact Child Protective Services and when they need to contact the police immediately in the event of potential danger. So, all right, so we're moving really quickly here, but I want to actually use a couple of scenarios and invite you to indicate whether you think that the scenario is worth reporting it. So reporting it either to a supervisor or to Child Protective Services, recording it, so filling out an incident report, or ignoring it. And you may want to use something like this with your volunteers to get them thinking about how are they going to react and respond to a situation. So here's the first scenario. One of the kids in children's worship is goofing off and being a troublemaker. You mention that if they don't sit down and listen, you will have to let their parents know. The child bursts into tears and begs you not to say anything to his dad because he'll be in so much trouble. He tells you he's afraid of getting another spanking. What do you do? And you can put this in the chat. Do you report it? Oh, sorry, we have a poll for this. Do you report it? Do you record it? Or do you ignore it?
Give it a couple more seconds for everybody to give their answer. We have about half the people who have so far. All right.
All right, so 11% said report it, 79% said record it, and 11% said ignore it. So that's really interesting. I think in this situation, while corporal punishment is not something we is very common or popular anymore in terms of a means of disciplining children, there are still parents and families who will occasionally spank their child. So I think this is one of those incidents where you actually don't have enough information. And so I would record it and then look for other indications that there might be something wrong in this situation that would cause you concern about abuse. So in this situation, I would probably encourage people to record it, not yet report it, not raise it to the level of reporting, and not ignore it because it could be something. I actually need to step out. So
Yeah.
I am going to let Becky and Eric continue with the webinar.
Okay. Do you want me to read? So the next scenario, I'll do one more scenario and then we'll move on to some best practices. So you find out that one of the young ladies in your high school youth group is concerned that she is pregnant. You you didn't even know she had a boyfriend. When you ask her, she begs you to say not to say anything, as she has promised not to tell. She is in a relationship with one of the teachers at her high school. The relationship started over 2 years ago. So again, with this one, are you going to report it, record it, or ignore it? All right, this is a clear cut. Good job, 100%. We're getting that people are going to be reporting this one. Yeah, that's exactly what you'd want to do. She would, especially when it was given that it was started 2 years ago, that would make her a minor. Eric, is there anything else that you want to add to this? Yeah, that's great. Okay, and I'm just realizing in the interest of time, I just want to get to a couple more screens. Here we go, some tips and tricks, because you do want to make sure that your training is exciting, but it's just some other areas just to think about. Don't go over 2 hours. That's a very long training. Make sure you have breaks. You're going to want to make sure that your training is annually. So as people come into your ministry, that they will be able to be trained. Who are you inviting? Ministry leaders and all the volunteers you should be encouraged to be coming to this one. The other thing to note is that you'll want different training for adults and youth. So just look at that you'll have 2 separate times, and the material that you will give to both of them will be slightly different based on their age and stage of development. And finally, you want to do both so get people excited about it at the beginning as you're gearing into training. You want to do some advertising in your bulletin with the pastor, just announcing that this is coming, and get people excited that you're having it. And then also afterwards, get some feedback, see how you did, where people would like some more training, what areas that they want more resources for. So make sure you're following up that way. And just finally, when we're looking at Plan to Protect, when I was doing the training, they have a ton of different training ideas. They've just let us use a few different ones just to tell you about. The first one is the telephone game. So that's basically, I don't know if you remember like doing this in school where you'd sit in a circle, go around and tell a secret. Every time you're going around in that secret, how does it change a little bit, right? So that just is a good reminder about the confidentiality that's important. The newspaper, have people just look within their, have some newspapers out and have them look for pieces of abuse, how prevalent it is. And finally, the other one is tell a secret. So find someone that you can just tell something that's a little bit more close to your heart. And how would you want that person to hold that space for you? So these are some different techniques for training that you'll want to incorporate. That would be an idea for incorporating to make your training interesting and just connect them. So we're just going to jump over that. We have put together a whole lot of resources on this page. As I was saying, we're going to put this up and we're going to be sharing this on the network post that we have related to this training. So not only can you get the video from today, but you can also pop into here. These are all active links. So it's our Safe Church Ministry website. We have a lot of information. The Safe Church Policy Roundup. We have our model policy plus other policies that will be important for you. We have a resource portal that is going to be coming, and we'll share more information about that soon. And then the three at the bottom, Plan to Protect, Dove's Nest, and Faith Trust Institute, are great resources for you that you can reach out to and get more information. And then finally, we just want to make sure that you're connected to us on the network, because that is really a space where we're constantly sharing and letting you know about our upcoming webinars. And I'm right at 1:01 and I realize that. So I want to just turn it over to Eric to just close us out. And thank you for staying those extra couple minutes.
Thank you, Becky. And there's so much information here, and we cannot thank you enough for not only joining us today, but all the work that is done in congregations and communities. There's so much that we can do for abuse prevention. That goes back to the why we do this work, to prevent something happening to someone we care about, or someone, any person to keep them from the different levels of devastation and the long effects that abuse caused. And so again, I want to remind you of our Abuse Awareness Sunday, which is happening on September 25th throughout the Christian Reformed Church denomination. And if September 25th is not a good Sunday for your church, you can have an Abuse Awareness Sunday on any day, any Sunday. And so we encourage you to order some of these. They're free for CRC churches to hand out to your congregation. And we also are requesting different levels of support for Safe Church. And so if you feel inclined to continue to support the ministry of Safe Church, I have put in the chat a URL that goes to our donation page. And so we appreciate each one of you and all of the work that you're doing in your congregation. So thanks again, and we hope you have a really good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.